Welcome everyone. Well, you should know, but this is a conversation series sponsored by NYU-LEARN. We are Learning Analytics Research Network here at NYU. Differently from a research center, we are actually a network. We try to connect researchers in all schools of NYU that are interested in the use of data to improve learning in different areas. Today, we want to talk about how learning analytics could be used in large introductory classes. And for this conversation, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Abelardo Pardo. He's a professor and dean of programs in engineering at the University of South Australia. He has been doing research for a long time, already 20 years. And she is interested in the areas of learning analytics and personalized learning. And until recently, he was the president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research. We also have the pleasure to have Tim McKay. He is Arthur F. Turnell Professor of Physics, Astronomy, and Professor and Associate Dean of Undergraduate Education at the University of Michigan. Since 2008, he has been working on using classroom and institutional data to make higher education more equitable, inclusive, and effective. In the last few years, he has helped to launch eCoach, the foundational course initiative, the Sloan Equity and Inclusion in STEM Introductory Courses project, and the Mellon College and Beyond second study. And to moderate this dialogue, we'll have Dr. Lucy Appert. She's the Director of Educational Technology for New York University's Art and Science Division, where she provides leadership and support for the effective and strategic use of instructional technology, for the division's 3 schools, including the College of Arts and Science, which have many large format introductory courses. Without much further ado, Abelardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Javier. I'm going to see if I can successfully share my screen then to get the presentation going. So this should be sharing, and this should be the presentation. All right. Hopefully, you're seeing the first slide in there.
Yep.
In order for us to get quickly into the discussion, which I think is the interesting part of this conversation, I'm going to introduce as quickly as possible the context in which part of the work I've done with some of the colleagues connects with this notion of how to support students, especially in large courses. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to talk to you in this format. I think it's a very conducive to the discussion and to exchange of ideas. And I'm also very grateful to share the session with Tim, a good friend, a colleague, and we've been working in similar area for quite a bit. Let me start I like to start this type of discussions from the common ground, from things that I think we all agree on. So this first one that I'm showing here is the importance of feedback in education. I think it's a non-controversial point, or I would hope so. Feedback is an element that helps students, helps learners through their experiences. And there's quite a lot of literature about what is feedback, how to implement these feedback processes, so on and so forth. Perhaps the most important one is there's people out there that even claim that it's one of the most relevant one. It's one of these complex pieces of a very wide ecosystem of factors that affect each other. But feedback is definitely has, or depends who you ask, has some prominence. So this is the first element that I like to consider, because all academics are sensitive or mindful or aware of this importance. And this is, to me, one of the connecting bits on why then things get complicated for large classes, right? I'm going to assume that every academic out there can provide support, feedback, and help the students navigate their experience for a small number of students or for a small group. The other element that has helped me also frame this type of approach is this duality that is ever present from my point of view in every learning experience, but we don't probably think too much about it. And it's the duality of judging versus coaching. In my case, for example, if I speak from my experience, when I found myself in front of a large audience, I see that they perceive me, large audience of the students, like a large classroom, I see that they perceive me sometimes as a judge, because I have to probably set up an exam. There are some requirements, a final score, a mark, and not so much as a coach. Whereas in fact, I know I can help them much more if I frame myself under the lens of the coach. So this is a duality that I've discussed with quite a few academics, and I think all of us think that our responsibility, obviously the institution tells us that we have to put a score or a mark at the end of the course, but at the same time, we really want to support our students, and that's a coaching role. It's not a judging role. The students typically perceive first the judging, not the coaching. Now, the other interesting thing is that, again, I'm going to assume pretty much every academic out there, if they agree that with this coaching part, which is when we truly support the students, the one-on-one coaching, the personalized coaching, where we understand the circumstances of the student, we understand all these elements of this very complex ecosystem with factors that influence each other, we probably are in a much better position to offer the student the right support. It could be personalized for just one student, could be for a group of 3-4 students, but things really get complicated once you are in this environment, which is 100, 200, 600 students. Personalization there is actually much more complicated. What we have done over the years is, if I could summarize it in a couple of sentences, is we discovered the space of gradually understanding what is happening with a large audience like this one. So obviously you don't have time to talk to all of these students in this classroom. You do not have time to spend 1 hour with each of them a week. It doesn't scale, but you may have a little bit of an approximation if you start handling data. And this is the connection with learning analytics. And this is, I would say, the discovery that we have a few years back, which is if we collect certain indicators, if we collect certain data, we may, and I put the emphasis on may because this is a proxy, we may increase our level of understanding of each student's situation. Now, we may still have a large class, like, I don't know, let's go to the extreme, maybe 1,000 students in an auditorium. And therefore, even this data is a little bit complicated to manage. But throughout our experience, what we have discovered is that even on those cases where we have like truly large student audiences, we can detect patterns, we can detect groups of students that have a similar context, we can detect certain similarities between certain students, and still opens the door for us to understand what is happening. If you manipulate the data and you have comprehensive data about how students are navigating that experience, then you begin to start analyzing a little bit the population, what is happening with the cohort, with sub-cohorts, or what is happening with an individual, how is the individual compared to the rest of the cohort or the sub-cohort. So at least you have the possibility, and again, I put the emphasis on the possibility, there's no certainty here, it's just trying to increase our understanding. You have the possibility of gaining a bit more knowledge, despite the fact that you're handling a population that is beyond the point where you can do it personally face-to-face. What is behind this approach? And this is something that we share, or we overlap quite a bit with the ideas that team has been working on. The idea is to try to capture what would be the steps or the rationale or the approach that an expert instructor would follow to try to support students. And we try to capture that with simple rules. If an academic that is leading or supervising or coordinating a large class thinks that there should be a possibility to talk to students that haven't used the discussion forum yet in the course, for whatever reason, or perhaps the coordinator wants to promote a bit more the engagement with that forum. What we're trying to do here, what we explore, is that space of capturing those rules, capturing that rationale, capturing that way of thinking from the instructor, and try to see if we can eventually connect it to certain personalized communication. So the idea is to ask instructors, ask academics to capture certain rules, which is the way they would proceed if they would have the privilege of sitting with the student next to them on a one-on-one personalized coaching, and see if we can find a little bit of a middle ground or an approximation to that ideal. The way we have tested in the past is with these personalized emails, where bits and pieces of that email are personalized depending on the context. And again, is by no means perfect, is by no means something that comes close to that personalized conversation that I showed you a few slides back. But the big discovery for us is that there is a space that is worth exploring, and there is a space for these solutions to make an impact, on the students. We would run campaigns of communication with the students, and those campaigns are personalized. And you might be wondering next, does that work? Do you really achieve, do they perceive it as personal? And this is the other exciting part that we've been working in a few years back. And we first run these campaigns, run these messages, and it's basically, You have a course, you run certain messages at certain times based on those rules, and you personalize them. And we thought we were happy, so to speak. We were satisfied with the effect, but then we thought we need to really go a little bit deeper and see the effect, not only in performance or in change in behavior, but also emotionally. What is the reaction of the students? So these are very quickly the two studies that I put in here. One of them is studying large first-year undergraduate courses, so it connects very nicely with the topic we're discussing here. You see there that the studies in 3 consecutive years is more than 200. And the way we did this was going back to 2015 with no feedback given, and then looking at 2017 with personalized feedback. This picture here is very interesting because it conveys one of the things we discovered, which is the need to carefully prepare, articulate, or choreograph your campaign. And we call them campaigns because the terminology they use in marketing, right? It's basically a systematized set of steps to connect with the students, to observe how things are going on their end, and then reach out to them with a personalized point. So these experiments or these techniques, so to speak, require typically an overlooked phase of planning, where you have to look at the course, see what are the best times for you to address the students, see what are the right elements of that communication, how to frame it, and Tim will talk a little bit more about that. It has very, very interesting results. And then plan those communication points very carefully. The first result that we're showing here is that we do change the way students approach or engage with the courses. And we do have a control group where the engagement is very erratic and sometimes is dictated by the student's perception of the impending deadline, or the student's perception of, oh, the course starts, maybe I should do something very quickly. So what we discover here with this type of experience and some other publications is that there is a space for that coaching role. There is a space for that communication that, even though it doesn't happen face-to-face or it doesn't happen one-on-one, we do manage to translate or to convey that one-on-one feeling to the students through those communications. And what we detect is a change in behavior where we promote sustained engagement and students react to those messages, and we start detecting changes in the way they engage with the course. The other interesting study that I wanted to share with you, just to, like I said, jumpstart the conversation, is the emotional aspect, because sometimes it's not only about increasing student engagement, it's also trying to figure out, trying to talk to them and see how did that message make you feel, and what was your reaction. And this is another very interesting study led also both of them by Lisa Lim, in which we looked at the type of emotions that the students were articulating in focus groups after sending those campaigns. But also another interesting result in this paper is if they were able to articulate actions that were derived from those emails. And the interesting result was that, as you can see, the emotions were not always positive and were not always activating. Some of them were negative. But we detected, or we understood a little bit better, the type of emotions that we can trigger with those emails, and also understand a little bit better how to start framing them so that the students perceive them more on the positive side, but also, perhaps more importantly, in the activated side. In other words, that the messages really help the students to reflect and say, okay, my next action then should be this one. So this is in a nutshell the context we explore. I guess the final summary that I'd like to convey to you before handing over to Tim and then the discussion is that, to be entirely honest, we thought there was not a lot of space on this personalization for large classes, but we were surprised that yes, there is a lot of details, nuances, the way the messages are written, as you will hear in a bit, the way the messages are scheduled throughout the course, the way the students react, the way you frame the overall campaign. It's actually a very complex and nuanced space, not a silver bullet, one more element of this really complex world, which is learning experiences, very, very complex ecosystem, but it does have a lot of potential, and the effect on the students seem to be positive. Just a final couple of details here. The infrastructure, or the tool that was underpinning most of these experiments, an open source project that I encourage you to take a look at it. And perhaps the final element that was very encouraging when we finished the project is that we realized that even though we are walking towards handling data, detecting profiles, clustering, applying clustering algorithms, we're basically entering the area of artificial intelligence. One of the elements that made us realize that we needed the expert, the instructor, the knowledge of that expert has to be also part of that recipe. And that led into further discussions with other colleagues about this notion of how do we handle AI so that it helps the students, it helps instructors, how do we empower the audience around artificial intelligence. And some of you may be familiar with some events that are happening in the near future. In December, free conference empowering learners in the era of the AI, which is a bit of an attempt to continue this discussion at a broader context. So I'm going to leave it here. Thank you very much for your attention and looking forward now for the second presentation and the discussion.
Thank you, Abelardo. Tim? You are mute, Tim. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, let me get this presentation going, and it's a pleasure, as Abelardo said, to have a chance to speak to you all today. It's wonderful to get to speak to people in so many different places, all at the same time. It's really one of the wonderful discoveries we've made in the last few years, I would say. I want to start off with a picture of practice. This is a picture of me, the blurry person in the front of a large lecture class, and it kind of describes the origin of my work on using data to personalize learning in large courses. This is a physics course that has about 700 students in it, and it is an intense experience. During the semester, I will spend 54 hours with those students, and each of them will spend at least another 100 hours outside of class. And when you add that up for 700 students, it's roughly 100,000 hours of human effort that will go into such a course. An enormous amount of effort, and that kind of effort calls on us to do everything we can to optimize the way that it happens. And I think that we know that it has not been an optimal environment, and that data can play a role in helping us to try and understand how to optimize it. These large courses are a particularly effective place to use data for a long list of reasons. They're also a particularly important place to use data, and I want to start by emphasizing that. Large foundational courses at universities are special for a bunch of reasons, not only because they're large. They also tend to occur early in students' experiences. And this means that the students who arrive in them have especially various backgrounds. They haven't been regularized by the system of the university yet, so they're coming from a wide variety of different backgrounds. This means it's especially important to personalize at this early stage. They also have especially various interests and goals. A lot of people take introductory physics for a lot of different reasons. Most of them aren't going on to become physicists. They have many different interests that bring them to these classes. And courses like this are essentially important in students' experience on university campuses, particularly on large campuses like my own. They play a real outsized influence on their major and career choice. If they do well in these classes, they might progress in that direction. If they don't, they might believe they can't and consequently don't progress in that direction. So they're really important places. They're also really difficult places to work. Changing these large courses is a major socio-technical challenge. It's not just a technical challenge, it's also a social challenge. We have to change norms around the design and the development and the delivery, even the conception of the purpose of these courses. And one of the ways that we can drive that change and support it is by taking new attention to data and what information technology enables us to do. So, we got a real challenge here. We have large courses where we'd like to personalize things for the many students who are in the courses. It's especially important to personalize here. And we can't do it, as Abelardo very well described, in a traditional way. So we're going to have to think about doing it in new ways. We're going to have to think about using data to help people in all stages of this. And I want to talk about that first in a general kind of way. We've got data, and we want to put that data to work. When I think about putting data to work, I think about a kind of spectrum of information agency. We have this information. How are we going to use it to put it to work? Well, one way we could use this data is to give it directly to all the people who are working on it. We could give it to the students, the faculty, and let them decide what to do. There are a lot of virtues of that and some drawbacks, but I'll talk about one example where we give data directly to people. The other thing we could do on the other end of the spectrum of information agency is give experts of some kind the data and have them make decisions for the students and the faculty and tell them what to do. And a lot of artificial intelligence systems and expert systems do that kind of thing. They analyze the data and then feed different things to people. Don't give them agency with it. I'll talk about an example where we do that as well. And then what I really want to focus on is the idea that you can actually get in between or do both things at the same time. You can have experts examine the data and use the data to help students and faculty and advisors to interpret that data. And then use the conversation between those two sides combined with behavioral science to sort of help people make the right decisions. Don't make them for them, but do shape a lot the way they might make those decisions. And I just want to stress that although this might feel special and new in the context of using big data to do this work, information and advising systems of any kind have always had a spectrum of agency like this. When you go to a traditional academic advisor and sit with them, they have all this information. They might either tell you what to do, or they might help to shape your decision, or they might just give you all the choice, right? So it's nothing utterly new. We're just doing it with a lot more data and information. So 3 examples, one where we give students the data, one where we give experts the data, and the third where we give data to both. Okay? So the first example is a tool that we've built here at Michigan called Atlas, which aims to deliver data directly to every individual on campus. I'm going to show you how we use Atlas to provide course information to students. It's basically an open website to everyone in our community. They can ask questions about any course or any instructor or any major on our campus and get a bunch of data in a report format. So for a course, for example, it will tell students a bunch of things that are relevant to them as they think about approaching this course. What has the grade distribution been like in the past? Who takes this class? Are they freshmen or sophomores? When are people typically ready for the class? Who has taught this class? How many times have they taught it? Have they taught it recently? All these kinds of questions. Some other questions that they get information about, what do students who take this class go on to major in? Which school and college have they been in? What courses have they taken before they take this class? What courses do they take along with it? What courses do they go on to take afterwards? Where does it fit into a curriculum? So we provide this information for all the courses that are on our campus. In addition, instructors can go into the same interface and go deeper with the data and ask questions about what's happening with different groups of students on the campus. So there's a tool that's been built that allows instructors to look at the relative performance of different groups of students on campus as well, as a way of trying to understand some questions about equity that they might like to go into. So this is a way of putting data directly into people's hands and letting them decide what to do about it. And these course cards have been joined by reports on majors and minors, the courses of study, and on people, students and faculty, along with some tools for curriculum exploration. We've done a lot here, but there's still a lot more we can do. And so we will continue to think about effective ways to put data directly into the hands of all the individuals on campus for them to do with it what they think they should. So that's one end of the information spectrum of autonomy. On the other end, we're doing some work that I think is very important for large classes, especially on course equity reporting. And here the idea is to take some very complex and often sensitive data and put it in the hands of experts to work on it. So the way we're doing this is to generate for courses a course equity report, which includes data, but also includes some framing of that data. So to give you some sense of what this might look like, this foundational course initiative that we have at Michigan creates course equity reports that look like this. So they're real reports with lots of text and framing, but they also include information about what's happening in the class. So just to give a sense of that, they look at things like outcome disparities for different identity groups. So in this figure that I'm showing you here, if you look just in the graph that's on the lower left of this report, you can look at what might be the different performance of students in different groups, either non-first gen students and first gen students. That's the first pair of columns there. Male students and female students in this class, non-low income and low income students, and majority students and underrepresented minority students. So we can look at kind of equity differences, and there's one example of what that might look like. We also do a lot of comparisons that are about relative grades. So we ask the question, how do students do in this class compared to their other classes? This is, of course, the one that's being reported on here, where most students do worse in this class than they do in other classes, but those grade penalties that they pay in this course are different for different groups of people, and that raises questions about equity in this class. So we provide this kind of data to the experts, the instructors of the course, but with a lot of framing to help them think about what these things might mean and what they might do. To give you another example, we want to think about the ways in which these various factors about a student's identity might intersect. And one way we've done that is to think about something called a barrier index, where there might be a set of different barriers that students might face. In this case, it might be first generation status, low income status, underrepresented status. And then we can ask whether students have 0, 1, 2, or 3 of these different barriers and see what the effect might be on their relative performance. And this figure shows that when students have 0 of these barriers, first of all, there are a lot of students who are like that. They have relatively small grade penalties in these classes. And as they have more barriers to their performance, those grade penalties become larger and larger. So we provide this kind of relatively complex and subtle information to the instructors so that they can think about these things. Here's another example, looking at intersecting identity, intersecting race and ethnicity with gender to look at the relative performance of students. So we're now using these equity reports with instructional teams to help them think about how they might change their class. On one end of the spectrum, we give it directly to everyone, to the students and faculty. On this end of the spectrum, we give it to experts and ask them to try to change things about the system. And what comes in between is a system that we call eCoach, which provides information both to students and experts and allows us to aggregate information about student background, interest, goals, and state, everything we know about the student, and then give that to experts and say, if this student was in front of you, what would you want to say to them? Very much the same way Abelardo was just talking about creating a kind of set of guidelines for how we would speak to individual students if we had that student in front of us. And then eCoach provides this deeply tailored feedback, advice, and encouragement. It allows us to tailor, of course, what to say, because you have different messages for different students. But it also allows us to tailor how to say it and even who says it, because we know from behavioral science that the way messages are delivered creates very different responses in people. So we often do things like deliver messages of advice in the form of testimonials from identity salient peers. What we're really trying to do with eCoach is to get to the point where the messaging we're providing is very tailored for students, but also is very humane and really feels like it's coming from another human in the way that it would if we were sitting with them. It's delivered in a timely way through multiple channels, including the web, as you see here, but also through emails and texts. And it has a strong focus on changing the behavior of students and their attitudes so that we can lead them towards student success in the different contexts. It's informed by behavioral science. In fact, we adopted these techniques from people who use this work in public health to try and change behaviors like helping people quit smoking or control their diabetes. So it was very helpful to us to have that extra behavioral science kind of context. Just to give some examples, we have information for students about many different aspects of a class. And one example that's shown here is, what do you do about going to class? And my response as a faculty member would be to say, well, you have to go to class. And we all know how effective that is. Students will then decide for themselves whether they're coming to class. They don't actually do what I tell them to do. They do what they decide to do. So behavioral scientists taught us that we should help students think about their decision about whether to come to class. Rather than telling them what to do, we should help them think through making their own decision about what they're going to do. And so our behavioral scientists have helped us craft messages that are much more effective than the ones we would have created ourselves. And so lots of different aspects of the courses and what students need to do in them are considered in these. So lots here. I mostly wanted to introduce it so that you can ask questions when the time comes. I do want to stress that doing this kind of work is very complex and requires a lot of different skills and a lot of effort from a lot of people. At the center of a lot of this work is a group of people at the U of M Center for Academic Innovation, especially the software development team that's led by Ben Hayward and the behavioral science team that's led by Holly Derry. Also the research and development team that Kate Hayward leads has played a key role, especially in the equity reporting project. We get support all the time from our information technology people who are truly crucial, and we collaborate closely with our Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. My own work on this takes place within the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, where I have the good fortune to work with people who have a deep understanding of the subtleties of doing this work. And I really wouldn't be able to do what I do without the expertise that they bring to it. So I'll stop there, and we'll be happy to take lots of questions from all of you. Thank
you, Tim. Lucy, get this conversation going.
Great. So thanks so much to you both for this presentations. It's really exciting. It's exciting to see these products and projects that I've heard a lot about, and to hear how they have developed. In arts and science here at NYU, we have a lot of large format courses as the types that you have described. We have a couple that are about 700 student courses that are back to back. You know, they are required for medical students, the types of things that you're talking about, in addition to a lot that happen within disciplines. And, you know, the things that I've noticed are that these are amazing products that you all have that could be very, very helpful. But I haven't seen an organized effort in terms of adoption. And so I wonder if we could start our conversation talking about adoption. How do you make these products into something that people want to use? And I think, Tim, in your case, there's actually been kind of a push from the academic side as well. There's kind of been in the foundational courses, so that may be a part of it. But Abelardo, I'd be interested to understand for yours as well. So whichever one of you would like to start.
You go, Tim.
Okay, you know, I said at the beginning of my talk that working on transforming these courses is very much a socio-technical. And my own experience, and I think the experience of most instructors who have taught these large courses, is that they're enormously difficult just to execute at the base level, right? They are, in that sense, in some way, under-supported, right? It's very, very, people are stretched very thin trying to teach these classes. They're also very committed. They wouldn't be doing it if they aren't. So they really are eager to use things that will help them make the class better. But we have to provision that in a way that functions for them. And many people are responsible for getting this right. The instructors themselves play a role, of course, but those of us who are in administrative roles like me have to do what we can to make sure there are resources adequate to support them. This includes both helping to create and continue to support teams like our Center for Academic Innovation, who can build the tools and continually adapt the tools so that they work well in the real context of practice, not in the laboratory or a one-time trial, but you know, in a class that runs term after term. They've done a tremendous amount of work to think about how to interact with faculty to make it practical for faculty. And it took us quite a while to do this. We launched the first eCoach in 2011. We had expanded to 7 classes or so, but it's very difficult, you know, it's very effortful. And it's only in the last 3 years or so that the technology and the sort of social systems around the technology have reached the point where we now have, I think, 7 universities using this in classes on their campus. And it's kind of reached the point where it's not impossible to go to a new place and say you can stand up not only the software, but the system around it that might make it work. And, you know, making the choice about when to do that, is it mature enough to do that or not before you think about starting to expand has been one of the big challenges for us. Because, you know, you can have something that is a good idea, even works well in a certain context, but if you haven't kind of built that whole system around it, really hard to make it sustainable. So I'd love to hear Abelardo's examples about this too.
Yeah, no, I agree, and we experience all these elements that just described him. The elements that come to mind when we engage with partners to explore if this would be something that makes sense to them. The first element is just to make sure that we understand the course, we understand the context, because for sometimes the answer is no, it's not something that's going to help you as much as you think. So that's point number one, and it's surprising sometimes how many details that you find about how the course is delivered, the whole socioeconomic system and how all these bits and pieces play. We did have a lot of success with academics that are mindful that students need additional support, and they're also mindful how difficult it is to reach to all of them. So they really want to go that extra mile to remove that effect of large audience of students arriving class, even though they are being surrounded by 300 other colleagues, they feel lonely, they feel alone because it's a massive class. So to me, that's the tipping point. The other key element that Tim mentioned, and I couldn't agree more, is the support. And by support, we just not think about technology. So this is not we have to steer clear of techno solutionism, right? It's not that the tool arrives and all of a sudden all your worries disappear. It is about academic developers that help instructors to frame that knowledge. The way it's a bit of a blessing and a curse. On one hand, we need the collaboration of these experts in academic developer to understand what is the best context to apply this. But on the other hand, we cannot do it without the expertise of that context. The instructors know the dynamics of the course. They know the ideal points to contact the students. They bring all that contextual information, which is what makes it very valid, right? If it is a course on introductory physics, to be able to provide students with very precise suggestions and ideas for them to ponder. So I guess you have to line up these three elements: technology on one hand, the context has to require that solution, and then the support. When you align these three things, then you begin to see immediately how progress is a bit more evident. When, for example, we have academics that in these large classes, they rely on videos, but the videos are not getting the engagement that they were expecting. But then we deploy a campaign to highlight to the students the importance of that strategy, preparing the sessions and the assessments, looking at those videos. Then we see the data that is coming back saying, yeah, the videos are now used much more frequently. The tutors in the rooms, they begin to see, yeah, the students seem to be a bit more comfortable with these concepts. So we begin to tie that loop of those three elements and start looking at how they interact, and they create that sense of progress. But it's a delicate one to achieve, I totally agree.
Yeah, I was struck by what Tim said about just kind of how these are large moving beasts that just take out swaths of the terrain as they go through. And you know, if one error, one of our faculty members in our 726 student class will say, like, if something affects just 10% of the students, that's like an entire weekend gone for me because it's 70 students. So that that sense of like, I don't want to invest my time in it unless it's effective. And I think you kind of started talking a little bit about how you know something is effective. I guess, like, from the other side of that though, can you talk a little bit about how you keep faculty from misinterpreting things? Because just to think a little bit, I mean, we often will have instructors in large classes who come to them for the first time thinking that there's some magic in these numbers. You know, I've got a couple of horror stories of people who imagined that there was some truth in the LMS, but in fact, the way the numbers they could see, but in fact, the way the course was designed, it's really garbage in, garbage out. So I'm wondering, how do you keep them from misinterpreting? What kind of training and support do you give as you begin to bring faculty into this practice?
To me, one of the elements that galvanizes precisely that situation or summarizes it perfectly is when we reach out to the instructors to help us write those emails, right, or that communication. That's where you see that tension you just described. If the data is showing me this, that's what I'm going to put in the email. And what we found ourselves with those team of academics is basically having this discussion that data is not the truth, data is an approximation. Even though you might have evidence that the data is showing you certain events, you have to be a bit more skeptical. Lots of examples come to mind. Perhaps one quickly to share with the audience is when we are discussing engagement with video, right? And immediately the academic says, oh, those students that don't engage with the videos, then we need to write an email. Okay, fair enough, that sounds good. And the first sentence of the email is like, we know you haven't watched the videos, therefore, I would say no, because you may have some students that they watch the videos with friends and the other students log in, and therefore you cannot start that email with a certainty based on the data that the student hasn't watched the video, which takes them a little bit aback, you know, like, hang on, but you told me that I should trust the data, now you're telling me I shouldn't trust them. So it's a bit of a journey to explore that middle ground. What we think we have is we collected quite a lot of evidence that tells us that there is a middle ground, and that middle ground makes sense. But sometimes it takes a little bit of time to collectively identify that middle ground and convey that message. So there's no need for you to write an email very direct and blunt saying, another one of my favorites that I tell academics always to avoid, we have observed that it's not about you, it's about the students. So be much more conducive towards a positive message. How are you tracking with these activities? Are you aware of the videos? Are the videos being useful to you? That's exactly the same approach, but without this blind trust on the data. So yeah, it's a bit of a contradiction, right? Because we first tell them the data will help you, but then we tell them, but it's not going to help you as much as you think it is. So yeah, it's a very interesting journey, a very interesting set of conversations.
Yeah, and this is, this is getting into that kind of spectrum of information agency conversation that I tried to raise. Everything Abelardo said about the ways instructors might use this information is very important to keep in mind. They have views about what's going on in their classes and how to address it. They're not always right, even though they have a lot of experience and expertise. Just to give one example, a lot of people who teach especially large introductory science classes have a real belief that some of their students can do this and some of their students can't. They're quite convinced this is the case. And I can tell you that on our campus, there is no student on our campus who cannot learn introductory physics. There are students who do not learn introductory physics in our class. But it's not because they can't. It's because we've created structures that don't enable them to do so, right? And so when they see performance of some students fall behind that of other students, they're quick to blame students for this and to think there is a flaw in the students rather than in the course that they've created. So we've worked really hard to create a kind of collective conversation about the nature of these kinds of performance differences and where they emerge from, and to recognize that we have many places on our campus where those performance differences do not emerge, and a handful of places where they do. And those places and those courses are responsible for it, not the students. And being able to look at many courses in many contexts in these kind of ways can be a real help in that regard. So being able to move a little bit away from the feeling that the instructor might be responsible for the inequity that's in their class and getting them to see that it's actually more structural than it is their own acts or anything like that has been helpful. But you saw in the course equity report, for example, a lot of text and a lot of conversation with the instructor, because it is very fraught to share that information with instructors and can go really wrong. So we've been spending a lot of time talking not only with instructors, but also with students about this. When we see those performance differences, we all create reasons for them in our heads. And our reasons can be very different from the reasons the students describe. For example, when students find it difficult to perform equally well in a classroom, they may say it's because my colleagues in this class are extremely dismissive of me, right? And all we see is that they don't perform as well. And so until we actually share that kind of information with students and try to explore what might be behind it, what are the reasons that they experience a class differently, we could easily be very wrong. Anyway, very important topic. It is not one that most of us who are sort of data science people are that good at. So I really think about involving people who've thought more carefully about these topics in your conversations as much as you can. It's certainly been very helpful.
Wow, I feel like we could have a support group at 5:30 after this, and we could. It seems like we have a lot of the same stories. I saw a lot of hand claps. I think a question that emerges pretty naturally from what you just said is that a lot of people associate, and I think underpinning some of the instructor behavior that I've observed, and assume that there's a predictive magic, right, to these tools. So where are you in terms of prediction? That was the original place, right, of the great tutor in the sky that was going to tell you exactly what needs to happen. Do you do that? Do you want to go there? What's your philosophy in terms of that predictive piece of learning analytics?
Yeah, I hate it in some ways, maybe more than other people would, but I don't think that our purpose here is to predict anybody's outcome in any kind of way. I think we look at data to learn from what happened in the past. We learn from experience. So we've offered this class many times. We've seen what's happened in the past. we should be using that to change the future, not to predict the future, right? So, so when we have seen, you could say we've seen performance gaps in the past, for example, oh, we know they're going to happen, so we should tell these students not to take this class. I've seen it happen a lot of times. We give a math pretest in our physics course, for example. Its purpose is to help students understand whether there are elements of their math preparation that they should review before they go on in the class. But I have seen instructors say, if your score is below this, you should drop the class now. And it's basically using a predictive model. They've seen in the past that people with those low scores weren't very successful. And their choice about what to do about it is to say, go away. But there are other choices you could make about what to do about that. And they're not making them.
It's interesting. I just have to jump in and say, yes, we have the instructor for many years who taught our principles of biology class said he could give students 12 questions and he would know right from the beginning if they could answer those questions, whether they would do well or not. But his assumption was it has everything to do with the preparation they had. Nothing about the personal background of, whether they could learn or not, but just like, what kind of high school did you go to? What did AP look like there? What have you seen for biology? So it's so interesting to hear the different flavors that you can put onto something like that. Yeah. Sorry, Abelardo, you were going to jump in.
No, what I wanted to add to this point, I think it's a very important one, is the way I articulated in my head to try to understand it is two different levels. One is more advanced than the other. The first one is just using the data to try to understand what is happening in a very complex system. It's just being aware. And I like the point that Tim made about academics that totally convinced that they know what's going on in their course. And then they realize that there are other indicators that show them a picture that is different. So right there, just understanding better what is happening in such a complex ecosystem, that in itself already has enormous value. The problem we have is that we started the problem the other way around. There is another level, which is we could use that data for prediction, but that's a much more complex thing, right? The problem is that we started being dazzled by that prediction power. And that prediction power, we have so many other examples surrounding us more and more, right? With the emergence of the artificial intelligence now everywhere. We predict traffic patterns, we predict mobile usage, we predict customer behavior. That we kind of like jumped out of stage and went directly, oh, we probably can't predict the student performance. Hang on, just look at the context. It's a different context. It's a system that has so many variables, so many factors influencing that prediction has to be taken extremely careful. And the more I advance in this area, I agree with Tim. I mean, sometimes I don't even need to have that predictive power. What I need is, or what I'd like to have, and I'd like to bring it back to that coaching analogy. I like to have a really comprehensive view of what my students are doing. How is their journey how is that evolving or unfolding? Because I probably can help them. I probably can be in a better position to help them. So those academics, and I totally agree with you, Lucy, I've seen those academics say, oh yeah, from the very beginning, I can tell you which one will do A and B. It is then our job to convey to them that reliability of that predictive model they have in their head is probably something that they impose more than something that emerges naturally. There are actions, there are support activities that they can do to just not focus on that prediction and just focus on how to support the students, how to help them navigate that learning experience. So to me, I think we should shift the emphasis. Prediction is, it's a temptation, it's dazzling, it has potential, but in learning experiences is way of a too complex environment, which we don't understand enough yet. So let's focus first on trying to see what is the best way to support the students, not necessarily with predictions.
I love the way you brought us kind of to a counterintuitive place here, which is that, in fact, big data can actually be the way that we can help people make personal discoveries, and that rather than that we have instructors who are giving away their own agency by imagining that there's a system that could tell them better or could confirm things rather than taking them on a journey, which I heard from both of you about kind of this being a very organic unfolding process as you go through, which is quite the opposite of what people who have that predictive model think, right? Is like you put it in the machine tells you what's going to happen and you move out. There are so many great questions in the chat that we'd like to start moving through those. How should we do that? reading out loud? How should
Yeah,
we?
if you have a question, you can raise your hand, virtual
Great.
hand, and you can just say it, or we can start reading some questions that are already in the chat. So
Yeah, I put some in the chat.
go ahead, you can speak it.
Excuse me. One of the things that seems to be very important today when looking at analytics is the impact of the pandemic. I find more students having not academic problems, but bringing emotional problems into the academic world. And sometimes we look at performance and indicators and predictors, but what are we doing, or what are you doing to take that kind of input and melding it with the analytical information? And the second part of the question is, we're having to be using Brightspace, and closing the loop between the analytics provided in the LMS and the analytics provided by the analytics group is becoming quite a challenge and quite an effort on the faculty point of view, and also from the students. And getting response back once you learn something and you want to make changes to the LMS. Do you have a feedback path for IT to work with the analytics group? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, both about the social and emotional aspects of learning, which are central, and about how to actually close the loop. So to the first, I mean, one of the real strengths of the system we've built around eCoach is that we get information, of course, from the LMS and of course from the student information system and so on, but we also get information directly from the student. So we regularly ask them things about what strategies they're planning to use, about what their experience is, about what their affect is. We have a particularly effective tool that Patricia Chen from the National University of Singapore has created that's called the exam playbook, which helps people take a strategic approach to their exam planning and asks them a bunch of questions. What are you planning to do and when are you planning to do it? And then works on feedback with them. So these mechanisms provide the opportunity to engage with students about emotional and social questions, as well as ones that would be present perhaps in a learning management system, or seeing whether they're watching videos and things like that. I think it's kind of essential to get past those points, because eCoach was built in this kind of way with survey tools built into it. It is able to get additional information directly from students and then act on that information. So that's super useful. And also, I think I mentioned that we use it as basically a data aggregator. So the first thing we do with eCoach is connect it to everything that can be a source of data, including, of course, the student themselves. And that enables us to try to draw in everything we think we need to know within the system. And once we know it within the system, then we can use it to tailor things and so on. As I said, huge effort associated with it. Not an easy thing, not something an instructor is going to typically do. It takes a team of people and some years of software development to think about building something that can really handle that.
And two quick things, perhaps to add to what you just mentioned. Regarding the first one about the context surrounding the students, absolutely, that and the pandemic is showing us how important that is. Collecting that information from the students is probably the best way to go. If I go back to the analogy, what would you do if you have the possibility to do a one-on-one coaching with them? You'll ask them those questions. It's not going to be about how are you preparing the next physics test, is how are you coping with this mechanism, with this situation, right? So you definitely have to have that input. So the fact that we're using analytics or data doesn't mean that we have to give up on certain data sources. And in this case, they're crucial, the way they are navigating this situation. The other brief comment about the availability of data, I always like to differentiate between what the institution usually tells us, which is the data is available, and what instructors sometimes want, which is the data to be ready for them to be used. And we typically underestimate the distance between these two definitions. And sometimes I've been in many conversations where we seem to be in agreement. One side of the conversation said the data is available. The other side of the conversation understands, oh, the data is ready. And then it turns out to be a humongous gap between the two. And that's when things start not going as expected. So we need to be mindful of that distance.
Yeah, that sounds like the general technology. You can have this feature versus this feature is a thing, and we've seen it work. There are a couple of questions around language. I wonder if we could kind of combine them. One is a question about if you did any research on actual e-marketing campaigns in choosing the language for your campaigns. And then there's sort of a related one, part of Alyssa's question, which was around the more positive language in the e-coach messaging versus the more negative languaging in the what are those, disparity reports? No, the equity reports. So yeah.
You know, we've had an enormous benefit of working with the behavioral scientists that come from public health. Right? They're really very thoughtful about how to not be the professor. Because when our approach to changing people's behavior is proven ineffective over many, many years, and they can take the same message. You know, we have this idea of why it's so important that they should come to class, what should happen while they're in class, and they can shape it in a way that is just much more effective. So they try to create a voice for the e-coach messaging, which is sort of reasonably consistent and friendly and coaching and supportive. There are other coaching voices, and it's interesting to think about expert coaches, some of whom are very tough on you. And so there are a variety of kind of coaching approaches that can be taken. The one we've taken is a little bit more like friends and neighbors who are helping you out. They have experience. So if we do a lot of testimonials from other students. So we gather testimonials from students who took the class before who said, I thought I could study the night before, and then I found out that if I actually started a week before, I would do great, right? It's not impossible. I just had to do something different, right? And those messages from identity salient peers are just much more likely to be received than a message from Professor McKay, who doesn't know anything about what their circumstances are like.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And one of the things that is very interesting when you venture into this space is you pay attention to detect the data you need to have a comprehensive view of the context. But then comes this other piece, which is how do you frame your message to nudge, to change behavior, right? And it's a completely different piece, and it's incredibly important. We had a PhD student that did some basic work for us, trying to explore a little bit the techniques they use in marketing. Again, they do not have exactly the same purpose. At a certain level, they do, which is we would like to suggest our students alternative ways of thinking about their context, so they maybe choose different strategies. But we did experiment with elements like, for example, sending campaigns that have a very clearly identified simple step to action, right? Like the next step we recommend is this one, and we would personalize that depending on the context. And I think there is a space in there. Obviously, it's not about customers buying a product, but at a certain level, I totally agree the importance of behavioral science here is crucial, because it goes down to how can we convey to students ways for them to rethink about the context and adapt their behavior. So yeah, crucial bit.
We have a hand or a time. Should we go ahead and take the question?
Yeah,
Gail, go ahead, please.
Hi there. Thanks so much for all that terrific information. I just had a quick question about the, if we're looking at data literacy and the adoption by instructors and educators, have you explored that approach that you just described from, sort of influencing behavior and language towards adoption from an educator standpoint and not just from a student's? Because, encouraging the educators to consider that maybe data is not evidence is a process as well. And so have you looked at it from that angle?
Yeah, probably our best source of experience with that is this foundational course initiative, where a team of education research experts at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching work closely with the instructional team of a class for 3 years. And they bring in 5 or 6 giant new classes every year, and they keep them in for 3 years. So they have this time to really spend a lot of time with instructors thinking about what what data can and can't tell you. They can expand the data that they have. So they might start with data that raises questions like, what's going on here? I don't understand why that's that way. And then they have time to answer it and go in and find out what that is. So I think it is, and the other thing I wanted to mention is that that foundational course initiative works with courses that are large across all the different disciplines and schools and colleges here at Michigan. So it's not just science and math courses, it's also courses in public health and courses in anthropology and so on. So we have a lot of different voices in that conversation too, which has also been quite helpful to get smart instructors to realize that not everyone approaches teaching the way you do is helpful.
And so the initiative team described, which is staying with the team for a long time. I would like to visualize that like a horizontal approach over time. We've done vertical interactions with teams in other institutions, and that was one of the activities as part of that project that I described. So we would go into an institution, have these workshop and training sessions with academics, and that was precisely the essence of those workshops, which is explore a little bit more what data is giving you, what data is not giving you, explore the possibilities of you identifying the right time, the right place, the right format to write those messages. There was also a fairly interesting piece to convey to academics the need to start slowly, not slowly, but with only certain basic data points that they have, and try to get a sense of this space of, yes, I can understand a little bit better what is the context to the student, and therefore try to think about actions. The piece that helped us in that conversation that you mentioned, Gail, is focus on the action. Ultimately, we would like to go back to the students with a suggestion, with insight, with something that they will find useful. And it helped us significantly then to remove a little bit all this noise about how about the predictive model. Well, let's set that aside. Let's focus on how do we go back to the students with something. How do we support them in this journey, right? And we've had quite a few conversations that are vertical in nature, in the sense that we would let them academics and especially support teams, teaching support teams. So we used to run training sessions with both groups in the same room, which we thought it was very effective because it builds that relationship, that collaborative approach where the support team has some insights on what's the best way to articulate that campaign. However, that academic that has been teaching introductory physics for 15 years probably has some strong opinions about certain other aspects, right? And that's where that group of professionals has to find that middle ground and unpack all these details that you pointed to.
Okay, please join me in thanking Lucy, Tim, and Abelardo for this lovely conversation. I think we could easily go for 1 more hour. So thank you very much. Piece of, we want some advice from you. We are organizing this conversation series next spring in the Northern Hemisphere. So if you have ideas for conversations, contact us or fill in that poll. So again, thank you to our speakers, to Lucy, our moderator, and see you around on the cyberspace.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you so much.